"Guess how much money I have and I'll give you everything," said the millionaire, laughing arrogantly in front of everyone. He didn't expect the cleaning lady's daughter to respond with an impossible number, and an absolutely exact one. In seconds, the atmosphere changed, secrets came to light, and the truth began to burn inside that luxury room. The truth will surprise you. If you are interested in this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. The October afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office on the 47th floor of the Manhattan Tower, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table where Richard Thornton sat, surrounded by his 6 most trusted advisors. At 63 years old, Richard had built an empire that stretched across 29 countries, with 61 bank accounts holding a fortune that shifted and grew with every passing second. Money was his religion, power his daily bread, and control his oxygen. Nothing frightened him, nothing surprised him, until that Tuesday afternoon when his receptionist called with an unusual request. "Mr. Thornton, there's a little girl downstairs insisting she needs to see you." Margaret's voice crackled through the intercom, uncertainty evident in her tone. "She's the daughter of Eleanor, the cleaning lady. She says she has something important to deliver to you personally." Richard exchanged amused glances with his advisors. Thomas Bradford, his senior legal consultant of 23 years, raised an eyebrow. Jennifer Wu, his chief financial officer, smirked. The others, Daniel Morrison, Patricia Hayes, Michael Chen, and the youngest, Jacob Miller, all looked equally puzzled. "Does she want money?" Richard asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "No, sir. She just says it's important. She won't leave." Richard felt a flicker of curiosity pierce through his usual boredom. Board meetings, market analyses, acquisition strategies, they all blurred together into a monotonous parade of predictable victories. Perhaps a 7-year-old child would provide some entertainment. "Send her up," he said, a slight smile playing at his lips. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and a small figure stepped into the vast office. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, wearing a simple white blouse, worn sandals, and a faded pink ribbon in her dark hair. She carried a small notebook clutched against her chest. What struck Richard immediately wasn't her modest appearance, but her eyes. They held a depth, a knowing quality that seemed impossible for someone her age. She walked across the expensive carpet without hesitation, without fear, as if she belonged there. "Hello, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Hello there," Richard replied, his tone patronizing. "What's your name?" "Sarah." "Well, Sarah, what's so important that you needed to see me?" The girl looked around the room, her gaze settling on each advisor before returning to Richard. Then she smiled, a gentle, almost sad smile. "I know exactly how much money you have." The room erupted in laughter. Thomas Bradford chuckled, shaking his head. Jennifer Wu covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Even the normally serious Michael Chen cracked a smile. Richard leaned forward, deciding to play along. "Is that so, and how much do you think I have?" "I don't think. I know," Sarah replied calmly. "All right then," Richard said, his smile widening. "Tell you what, little one, if you can tell me the exact amount of money I have right now, down to the last cent, I'll give it all to you. Every single penny. How does that sound?" The advisors laughed harder. Patricia Hayes whispered something to Daniel Morrison, who grinned. But Sarah's expression didn't change. She opened her notebook, glanced at a page, then looked directly into Richard's eyes. $1,147,823,517.91. The laughter died instantly. Richard's smile froze. The number was so specific, so precise, that it cut through the room like a blade. He glanced at Jennifer Wu, who had already pulled out her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Check it," Richard said, his voice no longer amused. "Check everything." What followed was 27 minutes of intense activity. Jennifer coordinated with Thomas and Michael, accessing secure banking systems across multiple continents. They calculated real-time cryptocurrency values, offshore accounts, property holdings, stock portfolios, and investment funds. The room fell silent except for the clicking of keyboards and hushed phone conversations in Mandarin, German, and Portuguese. Richard watched Sarah during this time. She stood perfectly still, her notebook closed, her expression serene. She didn't fidget like a normal child. She didn't look around nervously. She simply waited, as if she already knew what they would find. Finally, Jennifer looked up, her face pale. Thomas Bradford had removed his glasses and was wiping them repeatedly, a nervous habit Richard had never seen in 2 decades of working. Together. Michael Chen stared at his screen as if it had betrayed him. "Well?" Richard demanded. Jennifer swallowed hard. "It's exact, down to the cent. $1,147,823,517.91. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine unease. How could a 7-year-old child possibly know this? His financial information was protected by the most sophisticated security systems money could buy. Even his advisors didn't have access to the complete picture. "How did you know that?" Richard asked, his voice harder now. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened her notebook again. "May I tell you a story, Mr. Thornton? It's called The Story of the Beginning." "I don't have time for stories," Richard snapped. "You promised," Sarah said simply. "You said if I was right, you'd give me everything. That means you have to listen." Thomas Bradford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jacob Miller, the youngest advisor at 32, stood up and walked to the window, his hands trembling slightly. Richard noticed but ignored it. "Fine, tell your story, then leave." Sarah began to read from her notebook, her young voice filling the enormous office with words that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and terrible. 17 years ago, on March 15th, a man named Richard Thornton was a mid-level financial analyst at Westbridge Investment Group. He had ambition but no capital. He had intelligence but no opportunity, until he found one. There was a pension fund, a small fund that belonged to 257 workers at the Riverside manufacturing plant in Newark, New Jersey. These were ordinary people, welders, assembly line workers, janitors, security guards. They had worked their entire lives, and this pension fund was their future, their security, their only hope for dignity in old age. Richard's jaw tightened. No one knew about this. No one could know. On March 15th, Richard Thornton accessed the fund through a series of carefully constructed shell companies and offshore accounts. He diverted $640,000. To the workers, it looked like a market downturn, an unfortunate loss. To Richard, it was seed capital, the beginning of everything. Jacob Miller turned from the window, his face ashen. "My father," he whispered. "My father worked at Riverside." The room froze. Richard stared at Jacob, seeing him as if for the first time. Jacob Miller, brilliant young financial analyst hired 3 years ago. Jacob Miller, whose resume had mentioned growing up in Newark. "Your father?" Richard repeated slowly. "James Miller. He was a welder. He worked there for 31 years, Jacob's voice cracked. "He lost everything when the pension fund collapsed. Everything. We lost our house. My mother had to work 3 jobs. My sister couldn't go to college. My father, he never recovered. He just gave up." Sarah continued reading, her voice gentle but relentless. 15 of the 257 workers didn't survive the aftermath. Not directly, but the loss destroyed them. Without their pensions, they couldn't afford medical care. They couldn't afford food. They couldn't afford hope. She began reading names, and with each name, a story. Robert Chen, 63 years old, suffered from diabetes. Without his pension, he couldn't afford insulin. He deteriorated slowly over 2 years. Margaret Foster, 59, had worked in quality control for 28 years. The stress of losing everything triggered a massive stroke. She spent her final months unable to speak, unable to move, in a state facility that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Thomas Bradford stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His hands were shaking. "I knew," he said, his voice barely audible. "God help me, I knew. I was young, just starting out. I saw the paperwork. I saw the transfers. I knew something was wrong, but I told myself it was just business, just another transaction. I never said anything. I never stopped it. Richard felt the walls closing in. Thomas, sit down. But Thomas wasn't listening. He was staring at Sarah as if she were a ghost. How do you know all this? How is this possible? Sarah looked at him with those impossibly deep eyes. Because I was with them, each one of them. In their final moments they told me their stories. They told me about the man who took their future. They told me about the system that failed them. They told me about the silence of those who knew but said nothing. That's impossible, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're 7 years old. 17 years ago you weren't even born. I was there, Sarah repeated simply. I'm always there. At the end. At the beginning. Wherever justice needs to be remembered. Patricia Hayes had tears streaming down. Her face. Daniel Morrison sat with his head in his hands. Jennifer Wu stared at her tablet screen, but Richard could see she wasn't reading anything. She was just trying to avoid looking at him. What do you want? Richard asked, and for the first time in decades he heard fear in his own voice. Sarah closed her notebook. I want to offer you something. A choice. You promised me everything if I was right. I was right. But I don't want everything. I want justice. I want you to give $1 billion to the 242 survivors and the families of the 15 who didn't make it. That money will give them the retirement they earned, the medical care they need, the dignity they deserve. You'll keep $147 million, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. In exchange, you get something more valuable than money. You get peace, you get forgiveness. You get the chance to make things right. The office was absolutely silent. Richard looked around at his advisors. Thomas Bradford was crying openly now. Jacob Miller's face was a mask of rage and pain. The others looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out over Manhattan. 47 floors below, people moved like ants, insignificant, powerless. He had climbed so high, he had built so much, and this child wanted him to give it away. I fought for everything I have, Richard said quietly. No one gave me anything. I took opportunities when I saw them. That's how the world works. Then you refuse? Sarah asked. Richard turned to face her. In that moment, looking at this small girl with her worn sandals and her impossible knowledge, he made his choice. He thought of his reflection in the glass, his expensive suit, his position of power. He thought of everything he would lose. Yes, he said. I refuse. Sarah's expression filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to age her face. Then I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton. I'm truly sorry. She turned to leave, but as she did, every device in the room, every phone, every computer, every tablet, every screen, suddenly came to life. They all began playing the same video. Richard recognized the angle immediately. It was his office, filmed from the security camera he had personally installed, the most advanced surveillance system available. The video showed him just moments ago making his promise. If you can tell me the exact amount of money I have right now, down to the last cent, I'll give it all to you. Every single penny. And then it showed Sarah giving the exact number. And then it showed something else. Files, documents, transaction records, all the evidence of the original theft 17 years ago. Evidence that should have been destroyed, buried, impossible to find. But there it was, clear and undeniable, spreading across every screen in the office. Richard's blood turned to ice as he realized what was happening. The video wasn't just playing in his office, it was uploading, spreading, going viral across social media, being sent to news organizations, being delivered to law enforcement agencies. The trigger had been his own words. I'll give it all to you. The sophisticated security system he had installed, designed to protect him, had been turned into the instrument of his exposure. Within minutes, his phone began ringing. Then, the office phone. Then every phone in the room. The news was everywhere. The scandal was immediate and total. Richard Thornton stood in his penthouse office, surrounded by the wreckage of his carefully constructed empire. and watched as everything he had built began to crumble. And through it all, he could still see the small figure of Sarah stepping into the elevator, her notebook clutched to her chest, disappearing as mysteriously as she had arrived. The last thing he saw before the police arrived was Thomas Bradford's face, no longer that of a loyal advisor, but of a man who had finally found the courage to tell the truth. And Jacob Miller making a phone call, his voice steady now, speaking to someone about his father, about justice, about a wrong that was finally, after 17 years, going to be made right. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting the city in shades of gold and shadow, as Richard Thornton's world came crashing down around him, brought low not by a competitor or a market crash, but by a 7-year-old girl who knew the exact price of his soul. The arrest happened within hours. Richard Thornton, still in his custom-tailored suit, was led out of his penthouse office in handcuffs as news helicopters circled overhead and cameras flashed from every angle. The video that Sarah had somehow triggered had gone viral with unprecedented speed, viewed millions of times within the first hour. Financial news networks interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with outrage. The hashtag Justice for Riverside trended worldwide. In the days that followed, the full scope of Richard's crimes began to emerge. Thomas Bradford, consumed by guilt after decades of silence, became the prosecution's star witness. He provided documentation of not just the original pension fund theft, but of dozens of other questionable transactions over the years. Jacob Miller, driven by the memory of his father's suffering, worked tirelessly with investigators, using his insider knowledge to untangle the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The other advisors, faced with their own complicity, chose cooperation over loyalty. Jennifer Wu revealed the intricate cryptocurrency schemes. Michael Chen exposed the international tax evasion networks. Patricia Hayes and Daniel Morrison provided evidence of market manipulation that had destroyed smaller competitors and ruined countless investors. The legal proceedings were swift and devastating. Federal prosecutors brought 1,013 separate charges against Richard Thornton, including fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, and securities violations. The evidence was overwhelming, much of it coming from Richard's own meticulously kept records, the same obsessive documentation that had once made him feel invincible, now serving as the instrument of his downfall. The trial lasted 2 years and became one of the most watched legal proceedings in American history. Richard's lawyers, the best money could buy, fought every charge, but the evidence was irrefutable. The video of his confession, triggered by his own security system, played in courtroom after courtroom. The faces of the Riverside workers, or their surviving family members, filled the gallery day after day, silent witnesses to justice finally being served. Jacob Miller testified about his father, James Miller, who had spent his final years broken and defeated, unable to provide for his family, watching his dreams crumble because of one man's greed. His testimony was so powerful that even the judge had to call a recess. Thomas Bradford, now 71 years old, took the stand with tears streaming down his face. "I knew it was wrong," he said, his voice shaking. "I was 28 years old, ambitious, afraid of losing my job. I told myself it was just business, that everyone did things like this, but I always knew. And I stayed silent for 23 years. I enabled everything that came after. I'm as guilty as he is." The prosecution didn't charge Thomas, recognizing that his cooperation and testimony were essential, but his confession haunted him far more than any prison sentence could have. He donated his entire savings to the Victims Fund and spent his remaining years volunteering at legal aid clinics, trying to atone for his silence. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous on all counts. Richard Thornton was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison. Every asset was seized, every account frozen, every property confiscated. The billion-dollar fortune that had defined his existence was dismantled piece by piece. The distribution of the recovered funds took another year. $1 billion was divided among the 242 surviving Riverside workers and the families of the 15 who had not lived to see justice. For many, it was life-changing. Medical bills were paid, homes were saved, grandchildren could go to college, dignity was restored. The remaining $147 million, along with additional funds recovered from Richard's other illegal activities, went to establish a victims' compensation fund and to support financial fraud investigations across the country. Richard Thornton became prisoner number 95104 at a maximum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. The man who had once controlled billions, who had dined with senators and CEOs, who had lived in penthouses and traveled in private jets, now lived in an 8x10 cell. He had no visitors. His former friends and associates wanted nothing to do with him. His name became synonymous with greed and corruption. In prison, something broke inside Richard's mind. He became obsessed with the number, repeating it endlessly to anyone who would listen and many who wouldn't. $1,147,823,517.91. He would write it on every surface, mutter it in his sleep, trace it in the air with his finger. The other inmates learned to avoid him. The years passed slowly. Richard's health deteriorated. The stress, the isolation, the weight of his crimes all took their toll. His hair turned white, his face became gaunt, his eyes hollow. He aged decades in just a few years. 26 years into his sentence, Richard Thornton collapsed in the prison infirmary. He was 79 years old, a shadow of the powerful man he had once been. In his final moments alone, except for a disinterested medical orderly, he whispered the number one last time. $1,147,823,517.91. Then he was gone. No family came to claim his remains. No funeral was held. His ashes were processed according to standard prison protocol and eventually scattered in an unmarked location. There was no grave, no memorial, no legacy, except the cautionary tale of a man who had everything and lost it all because he couldn't see beyond his own greed. But the story didn't end with Richard's passing. In Newark, New Jersey, on the site of the old Riverside manufacturing plant which had closed years ago, a memorial was erected. It was simple but powerful. A black granite wall with 257 names engraved in gold. Above the names, an inscription read, "In memory of the workers whose futures were stolen, but whose dignity could never be taken. May their struggle remind us that true wealth is measured not in what we accumulate, but in how we treat those who have less." Below that, another line, "The true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. No fortune is worth the cost of a single soul." The memorial became a gathering place, not just for the Riverside families, but for anyone who had been victimized by corporate greed and financial fraud. It became a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. The viral video that had exposed Richard's crimes became a case study in business schools across the country, used to teach ethics and corporate responsibility. Professors would show the footage of the powerful CEO making his careless promise, of the little girl stating the exact amount, of the moment when everything changed. This, they would tell their students, is what happens when you forget that numbers represent real people, real lives, real consequences. Jacob Miller, who had been just 32 when the scandal broke, went on to become a leading advocate for pension fund protection and financial transparency. He established the James Miller Foundation in his father's name, dedicated to helping families affected by corporate fraud. He never forgot the day Sarah walked into that office and changed everything. Thomas Bradford spent his final years writing a memoir titled The Price of Silence, in which he detailed his complicity and the moral compromises that had allowed Richard's crimes to continue for so long. The book became required reading in legal ethics courses. Thomas passed away at 76, having given away everything he owned, still seeking forgiveness he never quite felt he deserved. As for Sarah, the mysterious 7-year-old girl who had known the impossible and triggered the downfall of a billionaire empire, she was never seen again. Security footage from the building showed her entering the elevator, but no footage showed her leaving. The building's security team searched every floor, reviewed every camera, but found nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished. Elena, the cleaning lady who was supposedly Sarah's mother, was questioned extensively. She insisted she had no daughter, had never had a daughter. She had no idea who the girl was or how she had claimed to be her child. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that no birth certificate, no school records, no medical records existed for any Sarah matching the description. Some people claimed it was an elaborate hoax, that someone had planted an actress to expose Richard's crimes. But that theory couldn't explain how she knew the exact amount of his fortune, information that even his closest advisors didn't have complete access to. It couldn't explain how she knew the details of events from 17 years ago, events that had been carefully hidden and covered up. Others, particularly those who had been in the room that day, believed something else entirely. They believed that Sarah was exactly what she claimed to be, a presence that appeared when justice needed to be served, when the scales needed to be balanced, when the forgotten needed to be remembered. Jacob Miller, in interviews years later, would always pause when asked about Sarah. "I don't know what she was," he would say carefully, "but I know what she did. She gave my father's suffering meaning. She gave 257 workers their dignity back. She reminded us all that there are some debts that can never be hidden, some truths that will always come to light, and some kinds of justice that exist beyond our understanding." The story of Richard Thornton and the mysterious girl became legend, told and retold, adapted and analyzed. It became a modern parable about greed and consequences, about the illusion of power and the reality of accountability. Parents told it to their children as a warning. Teachers used it as a lesson. Ministers preached about it as an example of divine justice. And sometimes in corporate boardrooms where powerful people made decisions that affected thousands of lives, someone would remember the story. They would remember the man who thought he was untouchable, who thought his wealth made him invincible, who learned too late that some promises, once made, can never be taken back. The memorial in Newark still stands, visited by thousands each year. On certain quiet evenings, security guards have reported seeing a small figure standing before the wall of names, a girl in a white blouse with a ribbon in her hair holding a notebook. But when they approach, she's never there. Just the names, gleaming in gold, and the inscription reminding all who read it that true wealth cannot be measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives we touch and the justice we serve.